At 4:22 in the morning on February 15, 1967, a Bangalore torpedo tore a 10-foot gap in the concertina wire around a nameless hill in Quang Ngai Province. Through that gap came a reinforced regiment, North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,400 men, screaming, firing, flamethrowers spitting jets of burning fuel into the trenches. Inside the wire were 294 defenders. The math said it was over. The attackers had been sent to hit an isolated outpost. What their commanders had not fully told the men in the assault waves, or what those men had refused to believe, was who was actually in those trenches. Because when the enemy poured over the parapet expecting the defenders to break and run, the defenders did the one thing no attacker prepares for. They stopped shooting. They pulled the entrenching tools off their web gear, and they climbed out of the trench to meet them. These were not ordinary infantry. These were the South Korean Marines. And this is the night the Blue Dragons took a battle that was supposed to be their massacre and turned it around, completely. To understand what happened on that hill, you have to understand what the enemy already knew about the men on it, and why they came anyway. By early 1967, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had a rule about the South Koreans: avoid them. Captured enemy documents, recovered by American and Korean intelligence, laid it out in plain language. Engage the Korean Marines only when a victory was 100% certain. Otherwise, withdraw. Do not fight them on their terms. The Koreans called themselves the Blue Dragons, Chong Ryong, the 2nd Marine Brigade, in Vietnam since the autumn of 1965. They had built a reputation the way reputations are actually built in war, in close and in blood. The man holding the hill at Tra Binh Dong was Captain Jung Kyung Jin, commander of the 11th Company, 3rd Battalion. He had taken command only weeks earlier, in January. A correspondent from Time magazine asked him about the enemy massing in the hills around his position. His answer became famous. "Every day I want the enemy to attack my company," he said. "Always I am ready to fight." Remember that line, because within days he would get exactly what he asked for. The first sign came late on the night of February 14th. At about 23:20, 11:20 at night, a Marine in a forward observation post caught movement in the dark to the west. Shapes in the tree line, an enemy platoon, probing the wire, testing where the guns were. Jung did not open fire. He passed the word down the trench line. Hold. Let them come. They came. 10 meters. 8. 5. At 5 meters, the hill lit up. The 11th Company opened up all at once, and when the flares popped overhead, the Koreans saw a single body hanging in the concertina. The rest of the probe melted back into the dark. Jung read it for exactly what it was. Not an attack, a measurement. Someone out there was counting his guns, mapping his perimeter, getting ready to come back with everything. He spent the next hours redistributing ammunition, checking the machine guns, pushing his listening post back out into the black. He knew what was coming. He was right. There is a detail about these men that changes how you see everything that happened next. The Korean Marines who fought at Tra Binh Dong were, by the standards of the war around them, under-equipped. While American units were converting to the M16, the Blue Dragon riflemen were still carrying the M1 Garand, the 8-round 30-caliber battle rifle their fathers had carried in the Second World War and in Korea. They would not receive M16s in quantity until the months after this battle. The enemy coming through the wire that night carried rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless rifles, Soviet-made flamethrowers, and Bangalore torpedoes. On paper, the Koreans were bringing an old man's rifle to a modern regimental assault. What they had instead was training, and a specific kind of training. Hand-to-hand combat was not an afterthought in the Korean military. It was doctrine. Taekwondo had been built into the Republic of Korea's armed forces through the 1950s, and the very first Korean contingent ever sent to Vietnam, back in 1964, was not a combat unit at all. It was 10 Taekwondo instructors. The Koreans believed that when the shooting was over and the range collapsed to arm's length, the fight was not finished. It was just beginning. They were about to prove it. At 10 minutes past 4 in the morning on February 15th, the hills around the outpost erupted. Mortars first, 120 millimeter, 81, 61, walking across the perimeter, throwing dirt and steel into the trenches. Recoilless rifle rounds slammed the bunkers. And then, out of the dark, the sound the defenders would never forget. Whistles, drums, and hundreds of voices screaming in unison. Taihan! Radi! Radi! Come out, Koreans, come out! They knew exactly who they were fighting. This was no accident of the dark, no case of mistaken identity. The enemy had come to Tra Binh Dong specifically to break the Koreans, to prove the Blue Dragons could be broken. One battalion hit the 1st Platoon's sector from the southeast. 2 more battalions came down on the 3rd Platoon from the north. A reinforced regiment, folding in on 294 men on a 30-meter hill. And still, Jung held his fire discipline. The Koreans let the assault waves close the distance, and then every weapon on the perimeter opened at once. For the first 20 minutes, the wire held and the guns did their work. Then, at 4:22, the enemy changed the equation. Sappers crawled to the concertina under the covering fire and shoved Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosive, into the wire. The blast tore a gap in the 3rd Platoon's front, and through it came the assault troops with RPGs and flamethrowers, burning fuel washing across the parapet. Staff Sergeant Bae Jang-chun's 1st squad was directly in the breach. Bae took a round through the shoulder almost at once. His men looked to him to fall back. The position was untenable, the enemy already in the trench with them. Bae did not fall back. He gave a different order. Fix bayonets. Prepare for hand-to-hand. And this is the moment the whole battle turned on, the moment that made Tra Binh Dong a legend in 2 armies. As the enemy poured into the trenches, the Korean Marines did the thing no attacker expects a defender to do. They stopped retreating. In the words of the Marine historian who reconstructed the fight, entrenching tools, pickaxes, and fists became the Marines' weapons when the enemy entered the trenches. An entrenching tool is a folding shovel. Sharpened on the edge, swung two-handed in a trench too tight to shoulder a rifle, it is a medieval weapon. That is what the fight became. Not a firefight. A brawl in the dark with edged steel, at a range where a World War II rifle and a modern flamethrower were equally useless, and the only thing that mattered was who was more willing to close. Picture the conditions. Rain, fog, mud filling the bottom of the trenches, muzzle flashes turning men into strobing silhouettes for half a second at a time, so that you could not always tell whether the shape lunging at you was one of yours or one of theirs until it was already on top of you. Grenades going off close enough to feel through the ground. The enemy was not somewhere out beyond the wire anymore. The enemy was in the ditch with you, arm's length away, and there was no line to fall back to. There was only forward or under. What happened in those trenches over the next 2 hours survives in the record as a series of individual stands. Private First Class Kim Yong-dok stayed on his automatic rifle in the breach and killed 10 men before the position was secured. Sergeant Lee Hak-won, badly wounded and unable to move, waited until the enemy was on top of him and detonated his grenades, killing himself and 4 of them rather than be taken. Private First Class Lee Ki-on, fighting to recover the company's 60mm mortars before they could be turned around and fired back at the hill, smashed 2 infiltrators in the face with the butt of his pistol, then finished them with a grenade. Private First Class Lee Young-bok did something colder still. He let a group of enemy chase him into a stretch of trench, then dropped into a spider hole and rolled grenades back out at them once they had committed. 2 more Marines, Kim Bo-hyun and Young Sang-yul, hunted down a flamethrower team and killed it with grenades before it could burn its way deeper into the perimeter. None of these men could see the whole battle. Each of them could see maybe 10 feet of trench. And in each of those 10-foot stretches, individually, they decided the same thing. This line does not move. But courage in a trench does not beat a regiment by itself. Geometry does. While the close fight raged, the Koreans were playing a longer game. Their forward observer, First Lieutenant Kim Se-chang, worked the radio through the chaos and did something that takes a particular kind of nerve. He located the enemy's regimental command post out in the dark and called 105mm artillery down onto it. His assistant spotted the enemy mortar pits and directed counter-battery fire onto those. Piece by piece, the Koreans were decapitating the attack, killing the men giving the orders, and silencing the tubes raining steel on the hill. Here is the part that should not have been possible. Overhead, an American AC-47 gunship, puffed the Magic Dragon, with miniguns that could put a round into every square foot of a football field in seconds, circled uselessly. Fog and rain had closed over the hill. Puff could not see the ground. Captain Jung considered calling napalm directly onto his own perimeter to burn the enemy out, and could not because the pilots could not tell where his men ended and the enemy began. For the decisive hours of the fight, the most powerful air support on Earth was overhead and blind. The Blue Dragons were on their own, with artillery, mortars, and shovels. And then the Koreans stopped defending and started hunting. Second Lieutenant Shin Won-bae, the 1st Platoon commander, took a fire team and did the opposite of everything a surrounded defender is supposed to do. He led them out through the wire, 100 meters beyond the perimeter, straight at an enemy mortar section. They overran it, killed roughly 20 men around 3 tubes, and fought their way back. Inside the wire, 1st Lieutenant Kim Ki-hong led a squad-sized counterattack in a double envelopment, closing on the enemy still fighting in the captured stretch of trench. Kim killed 5 men with his pistol alone. The enemy who had broken into the perimeter now found the perimeter closing around them. And somewhere in that final press, the sound of the battle inverted. The enemy had come out of the dark chanting, "Ra-di, Ra-di. Come out, Koreans." Now, with the attackers trapped inside the wire and the Marines tightening the noose, it was the Koreans shouting it. "Come out! Come out!" The taunt handed back to the men who had brought it. The enemy trapped in the trenches would not surrender. They were killed where they stood. By first light, it was effectively over. Jung ran one last maneuver, pulling his 3rd platoon back toward the observation post to draw the surviving enemy into the open for a final envelopment. As the fog finally lifted, the sky belonged to the Americans again. 4 Marine A-4 Skyhawks came down on the retreating enemy, and helicopters chased them across the open ground. At 8 in the morning, 16 helicopters landed the 6th Company to reinforce a battle the 294 men of the 11th had already won. When the Marines walked the ground in daylight, they counted the cost of the enemy's certainty. More than 100 bodies lay inside the perimeter wire. Roughly 140 more lay in and around the concertina where the assault had died. The Koreans had lost 15 of their own. The men they had beaten were not amateurs. The regiment that assaulted Tra Binh Dong was a hardened formation, regulars and local Viet Cong fighting on ground they knew, led by officers who would go on to become some of the most respected commanders in the North Vietnamese Army. They also knew precisely what they were walking into. Vietnamese accounts of the battle record that in the days before the attack, some of the officers were uneasy about taking on the Koreans at all, and that more experienced cadres, men who had fought the South Koreans before, were brought in specifically to steady the ranks and talk them through it. This was not a unit that stumbled onto the Blue Dragons in the dark. This was a unit that spent days working up the nerve. When their assault stalled at the wire, the deputy commander, Nguyen Chon, later a colonel general and a hero of the People's Armed Forces, reportedly gave the order to keep pushing, open a new breach, only forward, no retreat. They did push. It cost them a regiment's worth of dead. And this is where an honest account has to slow down. Both sides claim Tra Binh Dong as a victory. Vietnamese histories tell a very different story of that night. They record their own men fighting with enormous courage, and they claim they shattered a Korean battalion. The exact numbers will never be settled. Contemporary Western reporting put the enemy dead somewhere between 240 and 250. The Vietnamese figures look nothing alike. What is not in dispute is where the bodies were found. They were inside the Korean wire. The hill stayed Korean. Time magazine, reporting the battle 2 weeks later, reached for the only explanation that seemed to fit. It was, the magazine wrote, knife to knife and hand to hand. And in that kind of fighting, the Koreans, with their Taekwondo, were unbeatable. When the action stopped shortly after dawn, 104 enemy bodies lay inside the wire. Whether it was literally Taekwondo in those trenches, or bayonets and shovels, and the flat refusal to give ground, is almost beside the point. The reputation the enemy had come to break was, if anything, now unbreakable. Korea decorated the 11th Company more heavily than any other action of the entire war. Captain Jung Kyung-jin and Second Lieutenant Shin Won-bae both received the Taeguk Medal, the Republic of Korea's highest award for valor, its equivalent of the American Medal of Honor. It was given only 11 times in the whole war. Tra Binh Dong is the only battle where it went to 2 men at once. Every enlisted Marine in the company was promoted a rank, the first mass promotion since the Korean War. And the reputation outlived the war. Decades later, when the United States Marine Corps built its own hand-to-hand combat program, senior American officers who had watched the Koreans fight in Vietnam pointed back to men exactly like these. Marines who understood that a battle is not over when the ammunition runs out, so go back to the hill. 294 men, old rifles from a war their fathers fought. A regiment coming through the wire in the dark, screaming at them to come out. And when the range collapsed to arm's length and the guns went quiet, they reached down, unfolded a shovel, and climbed out to meet it. The enemy came to Tra Binh Dong to prove the Blue Dragons could be broken. They proved the opposite.
If you made it this far, you already know the kind of story this channel lives for, and YouTube seems to think you're going to like the one on your screen right now. Go ahead and click it.